After spending much of his early career crafting science fiction, including the two Elijah Baley novels we've discussed so far, Asimov spent a great deal of his middle career writing non-fiction on a variety of topics. It was the decision at the dawn of the 80s for him to write a new Foundation novel that began a second wave of his famous series of stories. The reception of Foundation's Edge was so spectacular that Asimov decided to create this third Elijah Baley novel, and delivering on the implication left at the end of The Naked Sun, that Baley needed to go to Aurora, chief spacer world and thus the most important planet in the galaxy. Like in the real world, some time has passed for Elijah Baley. He and his son are both part of a movement on Earth to acclimate to the outside world in hopeful anticipation of settling new worlds. This is mostly the work of the young, who are better capable of adapting to the open, and Baley is even now sometimes uncomfortable, but adjusting. But it's not all sunshine and roses, leaving aside the fact that clouds in particular bother him. While the success on Solaria benefited Earth and Baley's own career, it has left many in the department jealous and anxious to see him fail. And against his wishes, a hyperwave drama based on the case was created, and it was shared around both Earth and the spacer worlds, giving him a reputation for brilliance that no person could live up to, as well as sharing the idea that there was much more to his interaction with Gladia than actually happened. So this call to go to Aurora is not met with joy, but dread, as this is likely the inevitable fall from grace that he's been fearing, if he screws up the case that he has been called there to solve. The case seems trivial on the one hand, and yet is of the greatest importance, as the entire future of the galaxy and the human race is hinging on the event and its outcome. It all turns around the willful destruction of a robot. What makes this political is that the robot, Jander, is the only humaniform robot besides Daniil that exists, and that unique nature is a source of frustration to Aurora's Robotics Institute because Dr. Fastov, the one incorrectly accused of staging that murder by Baley back in Caves of Steel, and also responsible for sending Baley to Solaria in The Naked Sun, Dr. Fastov refuses to share his secret of how to make a humaniform robot with others. The reason he doesn't is in part because the Institute, under Dr. Amadiro, wishes to develop humaniform robots with the reasoning that they could be used to colonize other worlds to pave the way for the arrival of Auroran colonists, so that moving to a new planet would be as convenient as moving to a new city. Fastov believes that Earthers are the only ones who will be capable of spreading across the galaxy in a sustainable way, so his group of humanists is opposed by Amadiro's globalists. The globalists contend that Fastov destroyed Jander to stymie their efforts, and the problem is that Fastov's pleas of innocence are hampered by his assertion that he alone would have the technical skill to bring about Jander's destruction in this manner, causing the brain to burn itself out. Baley is brought to Aurora in the company of two robots, his old partner Daniil, and a standard robot by the name of Giscard. When faced with this case, where there is only one suspect who insists that he is the only one who could have done it, and that he didn't, so it's just random chance, Baley wonders what the hell he's even doing here then. Proving Jander was destroyed by random chance brain failure, that's the work of a technician, not a detective. And Fastov admits it was an act of desperation given what is at stake here. He mentions in passing the tale of Liar from iRobot. It's a tale of Susan Calvin and how she dealt with a robot accidentally manufactured with the ability to read minds. Fastov also speculates on the possibility of extending the idea of the three laws to apply them to human beings, not to force them to conform to them, but rather to understand the rules that humans operate under, in a field that he dubs psychohistory. In this, Asimov first begins tying the events of his series together, confirming that the Susan Calvin-related robot tales are a precursor to that of the robot novels, and strongly hinting that Foundation is the distant future of both. Baley fumbles substantially trying to deal with this case, given that it is all the complications of Solaria, an alien world with a culture that he doesn't understand that frequently requires being outdoors, and the added problem of a means of killing beyond his experience. It would be one thing if Jander had been bashed over the head or something, but this way of killing, he doesn't understand that at all. The very act is so unusual, he and Daniil discussed the language around it and dubbed the crime roboticide. He attempts theories, someone accidentally triggering the event perhaps, or something similar to the Susan Calvin tale of two impossible to reconcile differences, but they're met with near laughter over his ignorance of robotics. Likewise, his attempt to draw sympathy from Fastov's daughter backfires when, rather than having familial attachment, she instead has loathing for her father, because he raised her himself. Perhaps worse, the simple act of conducting the investigation causes him to cross an unspoken of hard-line attitude regarding slander, which jeopardizes everything when Amadiro uses this as a reason to end the case and humiliate Fastov. Bailey is put to his greatest test and subjected to humiliation after humiliation. A man wants to converse with him in a personal, which is one of the ultimate taboos on Earth, and his being stranded in a thunderstorm all alone leaves him in a sorry state both physically and emotionally. Yet all of this is what one would expect of an Elijah Bailey novel, the cultural conflict leaving the detective off balance and yet trying to glean out the truth. What is unusual involves Gladia, who is still on Aurora thanks to Fastov, and who had Jander in her possession when the roboticide happened. But Gladia's storyline here is an extension of what she faced in The Naked Sun, but more open. There it was hinted that she was being emotionally stifled by a society that regarded her needs as literal madness. Now it goes further into the subject of her sexuality. Her desire to feel something with sex, and how much, like with her husband, she found it unappealing with Auroran men because of their way of doing it, performing it in a way that left her unsatisfied. Aurorans were very open about sex of all forms, so much so that Fastov berates himself for refusing to sleep with his daughter, Vasilia, when she offered himself to him. That was the cause of the rift between them. In Auroran society where parents didn't raise their own children normally, it was only an issue if procreation mattered as far as incest went. Unlike with The Naked Sun, Asimov doesn't spend nearly as much time expanding upon the society of the space world. Those ideas which are related are deeply delved into, such as the government, because it's related to the central plot, sexual mores, because it's central to Gladia's character issues, but otherwise there are few additional details reflected upon. Whatever might have changed, Asimov's focus was not on world building so much as world exploration, building things out wherever he happened to be poking around. Gladia's plot is certainly a very frank and open examination of sexuality. In fact, some have argued it's a little too dry and technical. She openly discusses the failed couplings with other men, acknowledges the existence of homosexuality on Aurora, discusses the topic of masturbation. Again, none of this is to titillate. It just discusses it because the subject is sex and Asimov feels no need to be squeamish about it. The next step is bringing up Jander, who was loaned to Gladia to provide companionship. While measuring him for clothing, she discovered what Bailey had, that humaniform robots are anatomically correct, and also learned that Jander was capable of fully simulating all male activities as a result. So she and Jander had sex, and it was the first time that it gave her any satisfaction. This naturally continued until Gladia thought of Jander as her husband, and she began declining other sexual offers, even a persistent guy named Gramianus, who was interested in Gladia because of her physical similarity to Vasilia, whom he was infatuated with because of reports that she was a virgin thanks to her father's upbringing. There's quite a bit of soap opera in this one. Despite being over his head in all of this, something specific has nagged at Bailey, but in the end, it has no bearing on the solution to his problem. To answer for the accusation of slander, Amadiro arranges a meeting with an official called the chairman, whose job it is to facilitate matters that are inconvenient, to essentially stop problems before they become a nuisance to all of Aurora. As an Earthman, Bailey is a barely tolerated insult, but he lays out the fruits of his investigation after just a little over 2 days, and first noting that Amadiro went out of his way to delay Bailey's departure from the Institute where he was being questioned, ensuring that Bailey would depart during the storm, and likely behind the sabotage of their vehicle, forcing its landing in the middle of nowhere during said storm. At that time, Bailey urged Giscard to escort Daniil to Gladia's home because the true target of the attempt was Daniil, in his estimation anyway. If Amadiro got his hands on Daniil, eventually he could glean how Daniil worked and use it to develop his own humaniform robots. This is dismissed as unsubstantiated delusion by a distressed Earthman trapped in a thunderstorm, but Bailey follows it up by showing how, in his effort to delay Bailey, Amadiro slipped up by mentioning that Jander was Gladia's husband, something he only could have learned from Gladia or Jander, because on Aurora, as free-thinking as they might seem, it would be unthinkable for a human to marry a robot. Only one of those two could have told them, and Gladia, of course, told no one. Bailey proves that Amadiro could have provided himself with the opportunity by having Vasilia, who works at the Institute, encourage Gramianus to pursue Gladia, specifically by taking her on long walks like she, as a Solarian by birth, was used to. During that time, Jander would be left unattended, allowing Amadiro to question Jander remotely in a probing way to glean understanding from his responses. Interestingly, Asimov doesn't expand upon this, but he doesn't have to, because he had actually planted the seeds for this all the way back in Caves of Steel, when an Earth roboticist tests Daniil in that story by asking him a long string of seemingly unrelated questions to check to see if he had the first law. Thus, the series has already established that one can glean insight into how a robot works simply by noting its response to carefully constructed questions. Bailey suggests that this tampering contributed to, if not directly caused, the catastrophe that shut down Jander. Fastov still believes that it wasn't possible, but the mere fact that Amadiro could have done so, and through duplicity no less, would ruin him. So to save his reputation, Amadiro grudgingly accepts a compromise, a treaty with Earth aiding their colonial efforts, in return for which Amadiro not only gets Fastov's silence, but assistance from Fastov at the Institute in order to make humaniform robots. Once again, despite the hardships, Bailey spots the fatal mistake in his adversary's overconfident slip, and that leads to him winning the day. Of course, this is not the real answer to the mystery. Much like the previous two books, the true killer will be protected so that humanity itself will benefit from the deception. In Caves of Steel, colonial movement beginning on Earth. In The Naked Sun, stopping Solaria enforcing its dead-end form of living on the rest of humanity. And here, to ensure that humanity can spread amongst the stars without restriction. But the real killer gnaws at Bailey because it keeps coming to him in moments when he's not altogether thinking clearly. It's thanks to Gladia that he gets a hint, and this was because, as was hinted, there was sexual chemistry between them that, in the book, leads to her taking the exhausted Bailey to bed. As I've said, Jesse Bailey is not treated very well in the series, and this is perhaps the most disheartening of all of them. Not that Bailey, in his weakened state, didn't resist, but that afterwards he remembers his wife and solely thinks that, if word got out, she would be shamed. He's not in any way bothered by what happened, and has no sign that he has any sense of loyalty to his wife, but is going to instead indulge in this fascination that he has with this beautiful spacer. Given that Asimov was notorious for cheating on his own wife, I suppose we shouldn't be surprised that Bailey has so little regard for staying loyal to his own, who has already had the entire galaxy see her husband and this woman in a suggestive situation in this drama, and now, when he goes off to be with that woman, he's not in the least bit bothered about cheating on her. But on the subject of the roboticide, Gladia hears Bailey mention, "He got there first," which was a reference to an event on the trip to Aurora when Bailey was distressed, and Giscard reached him before Daniil realized that there was a problem. Giscard could only have detected that if he could sense Bailey's thoughts, and in private, Giscard confirms that he can read and influence minds. But because the first law is sacrosanct for a robot, his only concern with it was to help him better see to the well-being of human beings. Jander was destroyed because it was the only course open to Giscard, as he was bound by the first law on all sides. To confess his mind-reading would lead to his own dismantlement, which would prevent him from serving the cause of humanity. To allow Amadiro to discover the secret of humaniform robots would likewise doom humanity ultimately to stagnation and ruin. But to remove the impulse from his mind was to harm him. The only choice, therefore, was to destroy Jander's mind so that Amadiro couldn't learn from it. Giscard also manipulated Gladia, Fastov, and the chairman, all to bring Bailey here, to confirm that Earthers are indeed the best choice to colonize the galaxy. In Giscard, we are getting the first inklings of the ultimate role of robots in Asimov's so-called History of the Future. This was first considered in the aforementioned I, Robot, when robot administrators of the Earth have effectively taken over to, without public knowledge, rule for the benefit of mankind. Fastoff had mentioned that the more sophisticated robots of this age aren't going to be tied up the way that the robot in Liar was, because they're set up to weigh both sides and choose the path causing the least harm to humans whenever there is a conflict. Giscard's position near Fastoff has unwittingly placed him in a position where the well-being of the human race itself is being decided, forcing Giscard to choose the path to minimize harm to everyone. He has already begun his plotting, actually, but from a position of frightening benevolence. I say frightening because of the fact that the future is once again being directed by robots rather than humans themselves. And yet I say benevolent because they will be acting truly without any sense of self-interest. This isn't going to be the case of officials who, however well-meaning, are deaf to the valid concerns of their opposition simply because they're the opposition. Giscard's purpose will be to minimize harm to every group, hence why he's planted the notion of psychohistory in the mind of Dr. Fastoff. Knowing what is best would make his job of minimizing harm that much easier, including harm in the form of stagnation.